She wasn't a woman yet, just 15, no shoes, no coins in her pocket, just a name no one would remember unless they read it on a brothel ledger. She didn't dream of this life. No girl ever did. But in the filthy corners of medieval cities, dreams were cheap, and so were the women. This is the story the history books whispered about, but never told in full. The story of medieval brothels, of women sold, used, forgotten, and it begins with systematic exploitation. In medieval Europe, from 13th to 15th century, brothels weren't hidden. They weren't secrets. They were business. Cities, like London, Paris, Avignon, and Hamburg, ran entire red light districts. In Southwark, just across the Thames, brothels stood openly, operating under the blessing of the church. And the king? Yes, you heard right. The same church that preached purity collected rent from brothel landlords. The same crown that punished theft turned a blind eye to rape as long as taxes were paid. Brothels weren't fringe, they were institutions, and inside their walls, women lived a life no soul should ever endure. It started with poverty, a father dead, a crop failed, a hungry winter, and the girl, she was the solution. Families sold their daughters, sometimes for a sack of flour, sometimes for nothing at all. These girls didn't walk in. They were led in, led by the hand, led by desperation, led by men who promised protection but delivered chains. They called them public women, as if their bodies were part of the town's infrastructure, like a well or a bridge, used when needed. Forgotten afterward. Inside, there were no soft beds, only straw, no perfumed silks, only stained skirts reused day after day. The brothel keepers, often women themselves, acted as both madams and jailers. They set the rules, kept the books, and sometimes kept the beatings going. Clients ranged from beggars to bishops. Some paid in coin, others paid in power, forcing themselves on girls too afraid to scream. And when a girl became sick, number healer came, they called it the leprosy of Venus and left her to rot. In Avignon, under papal rule, records show church officials themselves visited brothels. Not in secret, not with shame, but with entitlement. In Hamburg, girls were inspected. Like cattle, before being sold to licensed houses, they were branded. Yes, branded, if they were caught working outside the legal system, branded with hot iron for selling their own body without royal permission. Let that sink in. They were punished not for being victims, but for not being part of the system that exploited them. Disease was a constant shadow. Syphilis, gonorrhea, untreated infections. Doctors didn't treat brothel women. They were seen as necessary casualties. They were dirty because society made them. And yet the same society depended on them. They said it was better that men visit a brothel than seduce an innocent wife or daughter. In other words, these women were sacrificed for the so-called purity of others. But perhaps the cruelest part wasn't the disease, or the branding, or the rape, it was the forgetting. No names were recorded in honor, no gravestones carved, only numbers and ledgers. 4 florins from one girl, 6 visits to the Red House. That was all they were. Their stories died with them. Until now, this is just the beginning. By the time she was 17, her eyes had dulled. The laughter she once had, gone. Her body, worn like a battlefield. But no war medal would ever honor her fight. She wasn't just used, she was owned. In the eyes of medieval law, she wasn't a victim. She was a commodity. And inside the brothel, that meant one thing: total control. In many towns across medieval Europe, Southwark in London, Cologne in Germany, Florence in Italy, brothels were licensed businesses. But don't be fooled by that word. Licensed. It didn't mean protection. It meant regulation for the owners, not the women. The rules were clear. You will serve, you will obey, you will stay silent, and if you didn't, there were punishments. Some brothels had dark rooms, not for pleasure, but for punishment. If a girl disobeyed the madam, if she refused a client, if she tried to hide money or escape, she was locked inside, sometimes without food or water, beaten, mocked, and when she emerged, she was told to smile again because another customer was waiting. But the customers weren't always strangers. Sometimes they were the priests who had heard her confessions the day before. Sometimes it was the tax collector who came not for coin, but for her body. The hypocrisy ran deep. In Avignon Church, Documents from the 14th century show brothel revenues were funneled directly into church accounts. They built chapels with blood money. They sang hymns in halls funded by suffering. The same men who condemned sin on Sunday paid for it in full on Saturday night. Let's talk about escape. Could a girl leave? In theory, yes. In reality, rarely. Most were too poor to flee. Some were too sick, and others, when they tried, were dragged back by guards hired by the brothel owner. In some cities, laws even required that runaway prostitutes be publicly whipped through the streets, humiliated, exposed, and then returned, like stolen property. Their crime, wanting freedom. But amidst the darkness, there were a few, very few, glimmers of rebellion. One woman, recorded in Barcelona in the year 1391, escaped her brothel and sought sanctuary in a church, refused to leave its walls. For 10 years, she lived there, surviving off charity, never stepping outside, because the moment she did, they'd take her back. This wasn't freedom, it was a prison with prettier walls. And yet, her story was one of the only ones that ever made it into record. So many others vanished. Not into death, but into silence. We don't know their names, we don't know their stories, but we know how they were treated as tools, as products, as problems to be managed, never as people to be protected. And perhaps that is the greatest injustice of all. Today, when we visit old cities and walk past cobblestone alleys, we marvel at medieval charm. But behind some of those stones, behind closed doors that tourists never notice, lived girls who cried into pillows, prayed without answers, bled without healing, and died without names. Their stories weren't written in books. They were written in bruises, in silence, in suffering. And now they're written here. Not every woman inside the brothel was a prisoner. Some held the keys. They were called madams. The women who ran the business, managed the girls, and dealt with the city officials. But don't mistake them for protectors. Many of them were once brothel girls themselves, and they had learned the harsh truth of survival. If you want to live longer, you stop being used and start using others. In medieval Cologne, madams were legally required to be women. Only women could own a house of prostitution. Why? Because the men in power believed a woman running it would be easier to control, more discreet, less dangerous. But these madams were sharp, clever, cold, when they had to be. They knew which girl earned the most, which customer was violent, and how much silver to slip to the city watch to avoid inspections. Some madams were cruel, even more than the clients. They kept back wages, they denied food, they punished girls who tried to rest or hide their illness, they turned suffering into profit. But others were complex. One madam in Florence, recorded in the year 1418, was said to secretly give food to her sick girls. She hid a runaway in her own quarters, risking arrest. She wasn't a hero, she was a survivor, like the rest, caught between two worlds, powerless. As a woman, powerful in her house. And yet, despite their influence, madams were still disposable. Madams were raided. Madams were whipped in public, their homes burned, their names erased. Society used them and discarded them, just like the girls they managed. Let's pause and ask something. Who really profited the girls? No, the madams. Rarely. The real winners were the men who stayed far away from the dirty work, but collected the gold. In London's the Bishop of Winchester made a fortune from brothel rent. In France, kings taxed prostitution to fund their wars. In Germany, city councils kept brothel books more detailed than their school records. That was the truth. A system built by men, run by women, paid for with pain. And when the girl was used up, when her body couldn't take more, when her health failed, there was no pension, no help, no future. She was put out onto the street, sick, shunned, and forgotten. If she begged, they called her a whore. If she died in the gutter, they said she got what she deserved, because even after leaving the brothel, the shame followed her like a second skin, and no one cared to peel it away. Death didn't bring them peace, only silence. When a woman in a medieval brothel died, there were no bells, no candles, no final prayers. She slipped out of life the same way she lived in it, unnoticed, unwanted, unforgiven, in cities like London, Paris, and Florence. Burial was a sacred ritual, but not for prostitutes. The church refused to bless their graves. Priests often declined to bury them in consecrated ground. Some were denied entirely, left to rot in mass pits outside city walls. In Rome, certain cemeteries had unmarked sections called terra mala, bad earth, reserved for the condemned, the unclean, the sinful. That's where they ended up, buried without names, without markers, without memory. And yet, these women had names once. They had laughter, families, songs they liked, dreams they whispered to themselves before sleep. But to the world, they were just brothel women, and the world pretended they never existed. Even in death, shame followed them. In some places, a prostitute's body was paraded as a warning. She lived in sin, they said. She died. In disgrace, in Cologne, officials hung signs on brothel doors when a girl died inside. This is the price of lust. But whose lust? The men who used her, or the system that trapped her? No one asked. There are stories, vague, half-forgotten, of women who died of plague, starvation, or beatings inside those brothel walls. Some girls were so young, their names were written in Latin as puella ignota, unknown girl, unknown in life, unknown in death. And the system moved on. New girls replaced them. New coin flowed in. New priests came through the door. The brothel never mourned, only reset. And so today, we walk over their graves, unmarked, paved over by buildings, shops, and churches. But under the stones, they are still there, waiting, not for justice. It's too late for that, but to be remembered. She never asked to be remembered. She didn't write letters. She didn't paint portraits. She didn't sit for historians. But she mattered, and this final part is for her. What can we learn from a girl who lived and died behind a brothel door 700 years ago? Why should we care? Because history is more than kings and castles. It's more than swords and coronations. It's made of breath and blood, of lives too small to be recorded, but not too small to be felt. Let's go back, not to royalty, but to reality. Imagine her, not the version we painted in darkness, but the truth. She had a name. Maybe it was Isabel, or Marie, or Agneta, a name someone whispered once, softly, before it was taken. She once held her mother's hand. She once laughed at a joke. She once looked out at the world and believed she'd have a place in it. But the world looked back and said, "No, you are not born for safety. You are not born for freedom. You are born to be used." She was never a monster, never a temptress, never the villain the church made her out to be. She was a girl, and then she was sold. That's it. That's the brutal, unbearable simplicity of it. For centuries, historians avoided their stories because they were uncomfortable, because they didn't fit the myth of noble medieval women spinning in towers, praying in convents, or dancing in silks. No, these women, the brothel women, ruined that picture. They were too real, too dirty, too painful. But if we leave them out, we're not telling history, we're telling a lie. Let's talk about something no one wants to admit. The system didn't break these women, it required them. They were the oil in the medieval machine. Their suffering was not an accident, it was a feature. Brothels kept unrest down. They gave powerful men a release valve. They generated revenue. They allowed the church to preach against sin while profiting from it. It was a trap with velvet curtains, and it worked perfectly until the girl inside it died and the curtains closed and the ledger opened again. You might be asking, did anyone ever speak up for them? Rarely, but yes. In the late 14th century, a priest in Bruges wrote a secret letter to a bishop, begging for mercy for dying brothel girls. He called them Christ's forgotten daughters. No one responded. And in 1456, a woman named Caterina, who once worked in a brothel in Venice, wrote to the city magistrate asking to be allowed to marry and leave that life behind. She was denied. The court ruled she was irredeemably stained. Her crime, surviving the system she never chose. So what happened to the brothels? Eventually, they faded. The Black Death killed many. Moral movements rose. New governments outlawed public houses, but the women didn't vanish. They were pushed underground, out of sight, out of protection, into darker corners, and centuries later, nothing really changed. Today, some things are different, but not enough. Across the world, girls are still sold, still branded, still discarded. The system wears different clothes now, but the eyes are the same. Cold, calculating, hungry for power, and blind to pain. And the question remains, will we look away again? If you've watched this far, you're already doing what the world refused to do for centuries. You're seeing her, you're listening, you're remembering, and that is everything. This video is not just a story. It's a grave marker, a voice, a tribute, a refusal to let these women stay forgotten. So when you walk through your city, when you pass a street or a corner older than time, pause and wonder, who stood there before you? Was she barefoot? Was she crying? Was she begging to be more than a body behind a curtain? History can't bring her back, but you just did. You gave her a voice, a name, a second chance, not at life, but at dignity, and that's more powerful than any monument. To the unknown, girl sold by her family, abused by the world, buried without a name, we remember you now, we see you, we carry you, not as a shame, not as a footnote, but as history. You were never the stain, you were the scar, and every scar deserves to be seen,